Credit cards tend to have a bad reputation as a tool that leads people to debt. But when used wisely, they're a great source of extra cash back or rewards. That's why I make a point to use my credit cards as often as it makes sense to. For example, because I do a lot of driving to kids' activities and sports, I usually have to fill up my car at least once a week. And when I do, I use a credit card that gives me extra cash back at the pump. Similarly, when I shop for groceries, I use a credit card that gives me extra points on my supermarket purchases. Since these are probably regular expenses of yours too, you should check out this list of the best credit cards for gas and grocery rewards. But there are also certain expenses I specifically won't put on my credit cards. Here's what that list looks like for me. Since my spouse and I both work full-time, we need to put our kids in camp for the summer to ensure we have adequate childcare. And because camp is expensive, we like to spread those payments out over the majority of the year and pay a portion of tuition each month. I used to put those tuition payments on a credit card to get the points, but this year, my kids' camp announced that credit card transactions would incur a 3% surcharge. Since my credit card only gives me 1% back on general purchases like camp tuition, it doesn't make sense for me to pay extra to use a credit card when I could save money by having it debited from my checking account. In my area, most restaurants tack on an extra fee for using a credit card. And while I find that practice annoying, I typically use a credit card anyway because I don't lose out financially. My go-to credit card gives me 3% back on restaurant purchases, and most eateries in my area limit their credit card surcharge to 3%. So while I don't gain anything in that situation, I also don't lose anything. But there are a couple of restaurants that charge 4% extra on restaurant meals. I typically try to avoid those places because I think charging more than the now standard 3% is obnoxious. But when I don't get to choose the restaurant and end up in a dining establishment whose credit card surcharge exceeds 3%, I pay with cash instead. In fact, if I'm going to a restaurant I'm not familiar with, I'll generally try to look up its credit card policy in advance so I'm prepared. And if I see that it's more than 3%, I'll stop at an ATM on my way so I have cash to pay for my meal. Credit card companies make money by charging interest on balances that aren't paid in full, but I refuse to hand over my hard-earned money for that purpose. For this reason, I make a point to only put expenses on my credit card that I can pay for in full by the time my bill comes due. This means that if I'm invited on a vacation but don't have the money to cover it, I'll say no rather than charge it on my credit card and deal with the consequences afterward. You may, at some point, end up in a situation where you have to charge an emergency expense on a credit card, like a car repair. In that case, waiting isn't an option, so you might have to carry a balance, pay some interest, and do your best to whittle it down as quickly as possible. But while it's one thing to pay off an emergency expense over time, it's another thing to pay off a splurge. I strongly recommend sticking to my rule in that context and only charging expenses you know you've got covered. Even though I use my credit cards almost every day, certain expenses don't belong on them. Before you swipe a credit card, make sure it won't cost you extra money in the form of added fees. Unfortunately, this newer practice seems to be sticking, so it's important to be mindful of it. Aside from emergency costs that can't be avoided, make a rule to never charge an expense you can't pay in full so you don't lose money needlessly to credit card interest.